Thanks, Rachel. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this Open Data Essentials webinar, where myself and Gui will be giving you lots of tips and tricks for preparing your data to share alongside your research. So this is what we're going to be covering in the session this morning. We're doing the introductions and welcome, but then I'll go on to talk about some definitions and terminology, as there's a lot of specific vocabulary that goes along with data and data sharing. So it's really good just to be clear on lots of those things before we get into too much of the detail. Then also through the work that Gui and I have done, we hear a lot of data myths and misconceptions. So we've prepared a sample of those and put together some information to try and target and correct some of those things that we hear quite often in the community when talking about data sharing issues. Then Gui will go on to the second part of the presentation, where he'll be talking very specifically about F1000 research and the platform and publishing with us there, and a lot of the information and tips that you will need to do that successfully in sharing your data to support the research, which is a requirement of publishing with F1000. So if we move on to the introductions. So yeah, as Rachel said, my name's Matt. I'm the head of open research for Taylor & Francis Group. If you don't know, so we're an academic publisher. We have over 2,700 journals in all different areas, from humanities through to genetics, life science and medical journals, under a few different imprints. So you may know us as Routledge or Taylor & Francis or Dove Medical Press. And excitingly, in early 2020, F1000 Research joined the Taylor & Francis Group, and I'm pleased to be joined by Gui Wright, who's one of the publishers in the F1000 Research team, who, as I said, will be giving you a lot of really specific information about how you'll need to handle your data to comply with their open data policy. Gui, was there anything you wanted to add there, or shall I move on?
Yeah, no, thanks, Matt. Just to say to everybody, thanks obviously for joining the session today. And as Matt says, I'll just be taking you through some in the second half, just a few key tips and tricks as to how to comply with the open data policies on F1000 Research. And I'll also explain a little bit about the backgrounds of the publisher as well. So don't worry if you've not heard about us before. So thanks, Matt.
Okay. So if we move on to the definition slide, so there's quite a lot of text on this slide. But I think it's really important to be as clear as possible on some of these terms, just so you're able to follow what we're saying, because some of it does get fairly specific in the second part of the presentation. But we realise that, as we've seen from the poll, 2/3 of the people haven't shared any data before. So this is really a starting from the basics to make sure that everybody can understand what we're doing and follow along and hopefully get something useful out of this session. So the definition that we use internally for thinking about data in this context is on the screen. So it says the recorded information necessary to support or validate a research project's observations, finding or outputs, which is required for legal, fund or regulatory compliance. So as you can see, this is quite a broad definition of data. It's from an Oxford University handbook on research data management. And so, yeah, this is really broad. It gives the potential for quantitative data, qualitative data, and data from all different subject areas as well. So we're working on the provision that most researchers will have data in some form or other. So next, data sharing. So this is quite a broad term that we use to cover a range of workflows and policies that are providing different levels of encouragement for researchers to share the data that's associated with their research. This is quite a broad catch-all term, and you'll see lots of the Taylor & Francis materials that we have talk very much about data sharing. This is a bit different from the next one, which is open data. So this is now starting to be quite specific about how that data needs to be shared. So for data to be open, it needs to be stored in an online repository and under an open license. usually Creative Commons license, either CC BY or CC 0. And these are the licenses that we also use to make journal articles open access, so removing a lot of the rights surrounding that. So whilst the data sharing is broad and could include kind of data sharing on request and those sorts of levels of policy, the open data is very specific about how the data has to be stored and the licensing that surrounds it. So hopefully that clears the difference between those two. The next thing on this slide is a term that you might hear a lot, is FAIR data. So FAIR is an acronym that stands for Findable, Accessible, Interoperable and Reusable, and is quite an aspirational term which shows kind of best practice for preserving research data. You'll hear a lot about how data should be fair. Not many people are saying how data must be fair, because there's still some, in some subject areas, things to still kind of work out about fully how data can be interoperable and reusable. And obviously there's all these different kinds of data that still need to, there's still kind of things to clarify in those areas. The next thing on my list is a data availability statement. So this is the section that researchers can include in their paper describing the availability of the data. And we ask for authors to include this statement after the kind of results and conclusions of their paper, but before the references. So where you're normally asked to include any other funding, ethical disclosures as well. And depending on the level of the policy that the journal, you may be asked to include different kinds of information in there, and because you may have to have shared your data in a different way. You may also hear me refer to this as a DAS, because data availability statement is quite hard to say quickly. Then moving on to some more technical language around sharing of data. So when you load data to a repository, it will be given a persistent identifier, also called PID. So this is a unique reference number. That means that data can always be located. It's not specifically a URL, so a web link, because websites and web addresses do break and do, you might have heard of web rot, where like links start to break over time. So the idea is that these persistent identifiers mean that the data can always be accessible. The most common PID that's used for journal articles and for some data sets is called a DOI, which is a digital object identifier. But there are lots of other kinds of PIDs that are used, and some subjects have very specific PIDs that they use, like accession numbers in the life sciences and things like that. And finally, if I haven't already made it clear, a repository, and this is just an online database that's used for storing data and other research objects. But there's lots of different kinds of repositories, from institutional repositories, domain-focused repositories, and broad general repositories, all available online. And we'll talk more about how you go about picking the right repository in general terms in my slides, and then Guy will talk a bit more about that in his section as well. So if we go to the next slide, please, Rachel. So this slide is really useful when you start to think about the different ways that data can be used in a research project. And Guy will talk more about this with some very specific advice and how data availability statements should be structured for publishing with F1000, but just to kind of give a broad overview of the different things that we're talking about here. So if we work from left to right across the slide, the first box we've got here is source data. And this may be data that is already available, that has already been created, that you might be using either in addition to any data that you've created, or is data that may be shared online by governments or other institutions or other researchers have shared in advance. So data that you've used as part of your study, but you haven't created and curated yourself. The underlying data, the next one along, so for F1000, this means the data that you and your author team have created for the purpose of this study is directly related to the key findings that you're reporting in your paper. And again, this may be in a different location under different license terms, have different availability to the source data which someone else has created. So we think it's really important that these two different kinds of data are talked about separately, and that there are clear links available to both of these different kinds of data that you may have used in your research study. The third box is extended data. So this may be other materials or data that have been produced as part of this piece of research. You may see in other venues people talk about supplementary or supplemental materials. So these are kind of things that may not be core to the findings of the paper, but other data and other materials that you feel you want to share with readers, but don't necessarily need to be directly referred to in the same way as the source data or the underlying data. And the fourth box you can see here is code. So increasingly we know researchers are using code to either collect or analyze the data that they're using for their research, and to make sure that research is as reproducible as possible. You need to be able not just to access the data, but also the code that's been used to analyze it. So if there has been code produced as the primary output for F1000, we do ask for that to be shared in a repository as well. So hopefully this gives a bit more information about the different kinds of data and code that you may be using as part of your research, and the different elements that we'll be looking for in the data availability statements. But as I said, Guy will talk more about this later. We go to the next slide, please. So then thinking a bit more in practical terms about how you get ready to submit your journal article, and specifically what you'll do with your research data. So firstly, you need to think about preparing your data for sharing, and you might want to think about file types, kind of metadata that you would use, different other information that you would need to make sure that that data is as discoverable and reproducible as possible for other people that may find it. Second, you then need to think about the repository that will be best placed to store that data. Once you've done that, you should get the DOI or the persistent identifier for that data, and you can use that to write your data availability statement that goes into your article submission. At that point, you can think about submitting your article, and then once you have your DOI for your research paper, you can go back and link your data to your article. So you're making sure that the dataset has appeared for the article and the article has appeared for the data, to make sure that it's all as linked up as possible. So you can see there's one star on the slide there about selecting a repository, and there's another there about data availability statements. And I'll go on to give you a little bit more information about both of these areas over the next couple of slides. So firstly, as I said, this is some general advice that you might want to consider when selecting a data repository, and Guy will give you a bit more specific information in his section. But there's a few things that you need to consider, or might be that you might need to consider. So firstly, if there are any policy considerations that you may need to be aware of when picking a repository. So depending on your institution, if you have any specific funding, also the kind of general trends within your subject area, there may be guidelines on where best to store that data. So for example, if you're working with genetic data, there's well-established genetic data repositories that would be the place that that data should be stored. You shouldn't really try and put that in a general repository, for example. Also, there may be technological considerations. If you need to have a specific kind of persistent identifier, if you need to be able to embargo your data to line up with publication, or have a kind of longer embargo available. Also being aware of the peer review policy of the journal. For example, if your journal of choice has a double-blind peer review policy, double anonymized peer review policy, having open data which has your name and affiliation on it and linking that to your article could break the anonymization of that peer review process. So some repositories allow you to create an anonymous link, so you don't break the anonymousness of that double-blind peer review. But all the different repositories have different functionality available, so you might want to check what you need and make sure that the repository that you choose is available to offer all of the services that you need. Data curation is another thing to mention. So also different repositories provide different levels of data curation. So domain repositories, so these are quite specific subject-based repositories, often run by academics or experts in that field. They will be able to provide, well, may be able to provide more curation, which could be checking of the data, checking of the headings, any standards that should be in place, also checking that the metadata that's provided about that paper, so this could just be like the author details, all of that sort of information is correct as possible. However, that's not a standard. So if you go to some of the more general repositories, these are more large scale, they don't have the capacity or the resources to do any of that checking. So it's more just what the author supplies goes up. So again, that might be something to consider if you want kind of expert help with checking some of that data. There is lots of different advice and guidance available from lots of different sources. So increasingly, university libraries will be able to guide you with advice on where to put your data. Obviously, publishers, so Taylor and Francis and F1000 and many other publishers also have advice and guidance on how to select repositories as well. There are also some repository catalogues online I'd encourage you to have a look at. The two main ones you can see on the screen there, so Fair Sharing and also Re3Data. They both have thousands of different repositories in different subjects that are included in those in their catalogues that can be useful if you're not sure where to find a suitable repository to house your data. We'll also be circulating the F1000 How to Select a Repository guide after the session. Next, I wanted to talk a little bit about data availability statements. So as I already mentioned, this is a short section that describes how the data sources that you've used in your study can be accessed. And as I outlined the different kinds of data that may be used, you may want to consider those using those as headings for your data availability statement. If you're looking to comply with an open data policy, you must include a link to that data set that you've shared and is open, and also its persistent identifier, so it's DOI or similar. I'd also recommend ensuring that you've cited that data set in your references as well as in the data availability statement. If you're not able to share your data for any reason, the data availability statement should still be included, but can be used as an opportunity to explain why that data can't be accessed. Common reasons are due to legal reasons, ethical, also commercial reasons are sometimes valid as well. And we both subscribe to the idea that data should really be as open as possible, but as closed as necessary, which just is saying that there are always going to be good reasons why data can't be shared, especially if you're dealing with kind of medical information, patient information, and things like that. We need to make sure that any individual's rights are protected. There's lots of different sources that you can use for guidance on writing a data availability statement, and there are some in the Open Data Toolkit that F1000 have prepared, as well as on the Taylor and Francis Author Services page as well. So next, we're moving on to some of the data misconceptions that we often hear when talking in different groups about open data sharing. So the first is that I don't have any data. So hopefully I've showed in the definition right at the start of this presentation that most research papers will have some data. It may not be spreadsheets full of numbers, as you might expect for a lot of science research, but there will be something that you've used as the basis for your study. This could be responses to surveys for kind of more humanities, social science areas. It could be drawings, it could be photographs, it could be annotations of literature. So all of these things that you've used to kind of as a basis for your findings would count as data. So I think most people will have data. So next, sharing isn't worth the extra effort. So I think there is work required to share data openly on the part of the researchers, and that involves right from the start of the project, thinking about how you want to kind of structure any data that you collect, and thinking about how you want to share it right from the beginning of that project. I think the benefit is that there was a paper published in PLOS last year that said that journals that link to that have articles with data availability statements that link to open data sets see a citation advantage of over 20%. So there is a huge citation potential for sharing the data that sits behind your paper. So I think hopefully many people would see that that is worth the extra effort. The third one is that I don't have time to share my data. So I think there's a few things to talk about here. So one is that many journals reserve the right to ask to see your data as part of the peer review process anyway, even if it's never going to be shared openly. So when you submit your paper to a journal, there is always a chance you may have to share your data with their editors and the reviewers anyway. And also, yeah, it can, depending on the data policy of the journal that you use, even the ones that don't mandate open sharing, you see many share upon request. You may get people contacting you years into the future asking to check the data that sits behind that research. So if you spend a bit of time in advance preparing any data that you've used, setting aside the files, writing clear README files or kind of instructions on how that data can be accessed and used, it's a bit of proactive work, but will save you a lot of time in the long run. Go to the next one, Rachel. So we've got two more of these. First is that data sharing is only for science research. I think whilst a lot of the discussions around data sharing have come from life sciences and are proliferating out into other subject areas, we are seeing lots of other areas now outside of the sciences engaging with conversations around data sharing. Researchers in psychology have been really engaged in data sharing for a number of years, and we're seeing that move into areas like economics and also education type research as well. And it ties into the really broad definition of data that we're using for data sharing that shows that data sharing is something that needs to be considered in all areas. We do understand that for humanities researchers, these discussions are still in very early stages, and there may be more specific resources that are needed to really help researchers in those areas have the skills and the resources and the confidence to do that on a more consistent basis. But as publishers, we're working to help with that. The final one isn't really a misconception as much as it's a common excuse that we get for people at the moment not really having permission to share their data. And for lots of these studies, it's where people are using old consent forms when they're working with individuals, and they're getting permission from these people to be able to use their data for research, but not to share it openly. And this is maybe just a reminder that if you're starting a new project, just to really check those consent forms, and maybe worth looking at updating them if you do want to think about sharing your data openly. You need to be thinking about that right from the start of the project, potentially using it or discussing it in any data management plan that you might put together to make sure that you are able to share that data openly. You get the consent and the permission that you need in order to do that right at the start of the study. Because if you only look to do that at the point of publishing your research, it's much too late in the process to do that. Okay, so that's the misconceptions that we had. Rachel, I think we had one more poll that we were going to do before we were going to move on to Guy's section of the presentation.
Yeah, let me just launch that one now. Okay, it should be coming up on your screen in just a moment. So in your experience, what is the biggest barrier to data sharing facing researchers? Is it a lack of time, a lack of support, a lack of interest, or something else? And if you vote for the last one, if you vote for other, I'd be really interested to see what it is that you think it is. So pop that in the chat box or the question box. Okay, I've got quite a few votes coming in. The front runner seems to be a lack of support. I'll just give it a few more seconds so that everyone has time to vote. Okay, I'll close that now and just share the results so that you can see them. So not very many people think it's a lack of time. Most people are saying that it's to do with a lack of support. A few people saying it's a lack of interest. I mean, that could be relating to what you were just saying, Matt, about some people see data sharing as only for science research, or they think it perhaps isn't as relevant to their field, so they're not as interested. And then a few people have said other. And I've had one person send in what they mean by that, and they've said they think it is a lack of knowledge on how to do it and how to do it properly. So yeah, maybe the kind of thing where perhaps some resources and support would be useful. But someone else say ethical issues with sharing their data. So that is that's really interesting. Thanks so much, everybody. Matt, I don't know if you have any comments on those results there, or if we're ready to hand over to Guy for his section.
Yeah, just I think the lack of support is not a surprise, but I think that's why we're looking to do these sorts of researchers from our point, these sorts of webinars to help researchers share and get some more information, especially Guy will talk more about the F1000 workflow, but give more information about what we expect from researchers and be really clear about what we want them to do with their data in order to proceed with publication. But yeah, I think that's yeah, so thanks to everyone for their comments and responding to those polls, and we'll hand over to Guy at this point.
Perfect. Thanks, Matt, and I really appreciate the very thorough introduction to everything to do with open data and the basics and fundamentals of understanding open data. So now what I'm going to do for everybody is move on to an introduction to open data at F1000 Research, and really delve into a bit more of the detail around the requirements for data availability if, for example, you were looking to publish somewhere like F1000 Research. So for those who don't know us, F1000 Research is an open research and open access publishing platform. So it looks and feels very much like an online journal, you know, publishing a range of original research article types from the whole range of science, technology and medicine through to humanities, social sciences and the arts. And we utilise an innovative, transparent post-publication peer review model as our foundation. And it's also worth mentioning we do run publishing platforms for sort of other key partners such as the European Commission, the Wellcome Trust and the Gates Foundation, and they all run on very similar publishing models and all have very similar requirements for open data. And of course, as Matt mentioned, F1000 Research was acquired by the Taylor and Francis publishing family last year as well. So the mission really is on the screen, but it's to enable authors to publish their work fast, openly, and without restrictions. And the publishing platform's been around since around 2013. And I guess we've always been at the forefront of data sharing and reusability, with open data as a sort of central pillar of that publishing model. So it's of particular importance to us. So looking at the F1000 data policy that we have across the platform, it does require that for any article reporting original results, authors should provide access to that source data which underlies the results of the work, which includes all of those types of data that Matt talked through earlier, as well as details of any software or code which is then used to process the results. Authors are then required to provide details of where their data is hosted, and actually provide that on submission of the article to the platform. So as a framework for this, we do endorse the fair data guidelines or principles that you can see there. And again, Matt did speak through those and what those mean. And then what I'll do later is I'll go over in a bit more detail about how those principles are applied in practice when it comes to providing data in a submission to F1000 Research as well. And I'll just mention it's worth noting as well here that one of the important things, one of the reasons why we're looking to do these kinds of webinars is that for authors submitting to the platform who are unable to provide their source data for publication without a good justification. Typically, that's one of the most common reasons we find for articles actually being rejected from the publishing platform. So just moving on to the open data policies at F1000 Research in a little bit more detail on how they work in practice. So as I mentioned, it does require authors to provide open access to any data that supports those research articles. And again, it goes back to that guiding principle that Matt mentioned, which was being as open as possible and as closed as necessary. And that's done for a variety of reasons, both to benefit individual authors, but also the wider community. And again, Matt detailed some of those in the kind of misconceptions section, but just briefly, it's obviously we're looking to do things like increasing data reuse, improving data integrity, and ultimately enabling that reproducibility in the academic community more broadly. So to facilitate that, and where it's possible to do so, we'll explain some of the exceptions later, but authors should look to deposit their data in a stable and recognized open repository under one of those Creative Commons licenses prior to submitting your article to F1000 Research. So the repositories would normally be subject specific in most instances, and we do actually have a detailed list of what we would refer to as approved repositories on our website within the data guidelines for authors. And then each article would then include a data availability statement in how Matt described it as well, which again is speaking to the route for access for reviewers and readers to any of that underlying data, in addition to the availability of software or code, or in fact any other tools and methods, what we refer to as the extended data there, used to generate the results as well. In terms of the software availability, we ask authors to state the version of the software that was used, details of where that software can actually be accessed, and any kind of technical parameters or variables that were used or adjusted as part of the analysis of the paper itself. So to achieve that, we would typically ask authors to probably submit their software to somewhere like GitHub or a similar repository. But at the same time, we would require a permanent archived version of that particular software stored somewhere like a repository such as Zenodo as well. And as I mentioned, there are exceptions made for reasonable situations where data can't be shared. So that's the as closed as necessary condition in the philosophy at the top there. And I'll just explain that in a little bit more detail now. So in terms of the exceptions, we do allow a few scenarios where the data may not be available or only available under particular conditions. So in those instances, details of the restrictions need to be provided within the data availability statement itself for readers so that it's really clear. So those might include, for example, ethical or security considerations. Someone mentioned ethical considerations in the comments to the poll just then. So in those instances, we would simply ask that authors provide a description of the restrictions on the data and any and all necessary information required for a reader or a viewer to apply for access to that data, perhaps in the same way that the authors did so if they weren't generating the data themselves. Then there's data protection, or confidentiality issues. So in those instances, we would just require more background information. So for example, if you have an institutional review board or an equivalent body who have provided statements about the availability of your data, and where applicable, we would require all necessary information required again for any reader or reviewer to access or apply for access to that particular data and the conditions under which that access would normally be granted. And then you have large data or data that's licensed by a third party. And again, it's a similar principle to the others here in that within the data availability itself, we would ask that all necessary information required for anyone wanting to access that data would be provided in the same way that the authors themselves were able to access that particular data as well. And those same exceptions would also apply to any software written as part of the article itself. There are some exceptions there as well, additional exceptions. So if you're unsure about whether you're able to share particular bits of software or bits of data within the article itself, my suggestion is always to contact the editorial office before submitting your article, because they can provide some more bespoke advice on your particular situation. And it's worth mentioning the only option we don't have on F1000 research is the option to state that data can be made available upon a reasonable request from a reader. And I just state this because it's a very common option for authors at many other journals that they would have as part of their data policies, but it's not an option that we provide. And that's really to stick to our mission of ensuring that the availability of data is really maximised for the wider research community. And I'll just also mention briefly as well that we have some really lovely functionality within the publishing platform itself that we hope is a benefit for authors and readers, such as things like code and data visualization, as well as reanalysis tools for data sets that are actually within articles themselves. And that enables readers to sort of interact and engage with articles online to a greater degree than you might find otherwise. We do also offer the option to publish data and software descriptions as standalone articles in and of themselves. So these article types would allow authors to provide a brief description, a rationale, and maybe use cases of particular data sets or say software tools, without the need to provide additional analysis and conclusions as you would typically have to do with an original research article. So just to move on and take you back to this diagram, hopefully you remember earlier from when Matt used it in terms of the step-by-step walkthrough on open data compliance. So I've mentioned a little bit about this selecting repositories, which Matt provided some great advice for. And as I say, there is some more specific, detailed list of approved repositories on our webpage that you can access if you need to. And then the next stage is when for example, if you were looking to submit your article to F1000 research, and after preparing that data and selecting and uploading to a particular repository, the next important steps are the two here. So you've got adding the data availability statement to your article, and then after that's happened, ensuring that the data are then linked back to that particular article as well. So if I show you an example in practice just to look at here. So these are two examples, actually, one on the left, one on the right, of a format used for data availability statements taken from published articles in F1000 research. So as I mentioned, those data availability statements shouldn't refer readers or reviewers to contact an author to obtain the data, but they should instead include some very specific applicable details of where and how to access any data which underlies that work. So for articles, I should also mention that for articles that have no associated data, or where the associated data are actually within the article itself, that should just be written into the statement, and that can be the extent to your data availability statement. And then for repository hosted data, the requirement is essentially that we ask authors to include the name of the repository used and the license used for that data, along with any additional relevant details, which might vary depending on the data site and the repository. Again, the full list of details of what that would entail we have on our webpage, depending on what type of repository you're using. But typically that would include at a minimum the name of the repository, the title of your data set, and the DOI of that data set as well. And then hopefully you can see in the red boxes here. So in this example, we've detailed, or the authors have detailed, the availability of all the different sources of data and extended data under those separate subheadings there. And the example on the left, it actually includes underlying data which is restricted to ethical concerns. So the authors here have just detailed the route to access for the data. And there's also here a couple of examples of using the Creative Commons or equivalent licenses for the availability of data and software. So we give examples of this specific style of formatting a data availability statement within the data guidelines online, for which we'll provide the right web page for at the end of the presentation as well. And then the final step is then to actually link the article to the data, as I've mentioned. So once your article has been published on the platform and these, the data availability statement is available and online within the article itself, we then ask you and advise you to go back to your repository, project the data with the DOI for the article, which will be emailed to you once it's published online. And then obviously then that ensures that the data in the article they're linked together essentially, and ensures that you as an author receive credit for both pieces of work, the article and the data itself. And just to talk you through FAIR data, so these are the same examples, the same data availability statements. So just to show you what that means in practice when we speak about the FAIR data principles. So in terms of being findable and accessible, meaning that obviously there's metadata associated with that particular article, which makes it easier to find by humans or machines. But also that it's easily accessible once it's findable. Sorry. There are DOIs, for example, here in the examples given, which are the persistent identifiers that Matt had explained. So here, for example, they're DOIs, and this is given for all the available data sets here in these particular examples. Then in terms of being interoperable with the data, therefore being able to be integrated with other data sets, there's an example here of using a CSV file type to meet this requirement, as it's a general file type that can be interchanged with others. And then finally, we've got reusable, which is enabled here by the choice of license for the data and software used, which enables that easy reuse and facilitates that by the Creative Commons licenses that are applied here, basically. So that is quite a bit of detail about how to comply with our open data policies. I appreciate it is quite a lot to take in. And there was a great point made in the poll that support is the main thing that the authors are looking for. And of course, that can come from several places. It can come from libraries, institutions, funders. There is a wealth of resources out there. So from the publisher side of things, what I would absolutely encourage everybody to do is take a look at the range of resources and help that we have online. For example, at F1000, if you're choosing to submit there, if it's a Taylor and Francis journal, there's equivalent resources online for each of the journals describing their open data policies. And the first place to look at for F1000 is the data guidelines here, which is the URL you can see at the bottom here, hopefully you can see. And there you'll find the same step-by-step walkthrough of sharing your data, which Matt and I have essentially described today. And if you are interested in submitting but aren't sure that you're able to meet those open data requirements, or otherwise have any questions, we definitely encourage you to send a query to our editorial team. Their email address is just listed again here, and they'll be able to provide any answers and sort of advice on your specific situation that you might have. And then just finally, we've got an additional wealth of resources available via what we've called our Open Data Toolkit page. So that includes information, advice, guides on a range of different topics that will include things like data collection, tips and tricks, file type formats, licenses, repositories, and of course writing data availability statements. So as a follow-up to the webinar, I would absolutely encourage you to go and explore these resources. Hopefully you can see the URL of the webpage here for this toolkit, and get more familiar with them, because this is a real range of support and resources here. And as Rachel mentioned as well, if some of you missed it, but we do have some of the most requested guides that we feature as part of this toolkit. Some of the most requested guides by authors and readers, such as those on formatting data availability statements and guidance on the FAIR guidelines. They're available to download from the handout panel that you should be able to see, and we'll also email everybody as part of the follow-up to this webinar as well, pointing out those particular resources too. So thank you for listening. I'll encourage any questions after this. Hopefully you do feel a bit more confident in some of the open data essentials that we've presented today, and I'll just hand back to Rachel for one final poll as well.
Thanks so much, Guy. Okay, I'm just going to launch the last poll for today. So you should see that popping up on your screen shortly. Hopefully it's up there now. So this is just so that we can find out a little bit more about topics you'd be interested in getting more resources, more guidance and support on. So you'll recognise we've touched on open data definitions, fair data, data repositories, data availability statements, and a little bit about publishing on F1000 research. So it would just be great to find out which of these you're interested in finding out a little bit more about in future. I'll just give it a few more seconds so that everyone has a chance to vote. Okay, we've got a front runner of data availability statements at the moment, but there's still plenty of votes coming in, so it's changing quite a lot. I'll just give it 5 more seconds to give everybody a chance to get their vote in. Okay, great. I'll just share that now, so hopefully you can all see the results. I mean, it's a real mixture there, but hopefully we'll be able to follow up and share kind of lots of information that address these areas. In terms of data repositories and data availability statements, as Guy just mentioned, there is actually a free handout in the handouts tab on the GoToWebinar kind of screen that you should have. So you can feel free to download those there if you're interested in those topics. And of course, we will be following up over emails, that you'll get a recording of the session, you'll have access to the slides, and we'll send you all of the links to our open data toolkit and all of our free resources that we've got online. There really is a wealth of information on there. And I'd encourage anyone who's interested in publishing on F1000 research to take a look at all of those as well, just to make sure that you are formatting your data correctly for submission, as that is something that we're very strict on. So you need to make sure that you have seen all of the guidance that we've got on how to do it. And of course, you can reach out. The email address, it will be on your screen in just a second. I'll just hide that poll. It's research@f1000.com. If you've got any questions about our open data policies, about how to format your data, please do get in touch. So I think we now have about 10 minutes, just under 10 minutes for some questions, and we've had a few come through. So if that's okay, I'll just move on to those, Matt and Guy. Let me just have a quick look. So a question for Matt. When we go about making our data available, how can we ensure that the aspect of copyright remains intact as we prepare our data availability statement? Do you want me to read that again for you, Matt?
Yeah.
When we go about making our data available, how can we ensure that copyright remains intact as we prepare our data availability statement?
Yeah, so thanks, that's a good question. So obviously we talked a bit about licensing of data in this session, and I think this kind of comes into some of the definitions I talked about right at the start. So the difference between kind of data availability and open data. So when you put your data in a repository, and there will be differences depending on the repository that you choose, you may be asked to select a license for that data set. And at that point, that's when you choose kind of how that data will be shared, how people will be able to access it, potentially reuse it, what kind of attribution they'll need to provide, whether they need to request access. So if you need to retain copyright for your data, that is the time where you need to select the license that allows you to be, I don't know, seen as the copyright holder of that information. But that is not going to be open data. So there's going to be restrictions because of the copyright of how that data can be reused, because people won't be able to kind of take your data and reuse it, build on it, kind of do the interoperability type things because of the copyright status of that data. So it's quite complicated and a bit tricky, but yeah, you kind of need to decide what you need to do and what's most important. So if you're going to keep, well, Guy might be able to clarify here, but if the data was copyright the author, that's not going to be allowed to then publish with F1000, the data needs to be open, so needs to have one of those open licenses attached to it, which means that you wouldn't be the copyright holder.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Guy, keep going.
No, I was just going to agree with Matt. That's exactly it. It sort of sets the tone, as Matt says. That's it. It's the first choice that you make, which I appreciate is quite tricky because you're perhaps having to make a guess at where you're trying to publish thereafter. But it's worth planning almost the whole journey out. You know, where you intend to publish the article, maybe what you intend to do with it further down the line, and that might help form some of the decisions about what you do with the data license at the very start, rather than following maybe the path of looking at what your funder requires, which is obviously also important, but it's maybe only part of that journey right the way through to publication. So it's definitely worth considering the whole spectrum right the way through to the publication and subsequent reuse of the data before selecting the copyright at a repository.
Yeah, I guess the other point I would make is about the subject element of this. So if you're a humanities researcher doing art research and actually the data behind your paper is a piece of art that you've done yourself, then I fully appreciate that you might want to retain the rights to that artwork because it's yours, or it's the same for like music or other kinds of creative research. Then it may be that you do want to retain those rights, but it may be that you need to find a publication venue that allows you to retain those rights to your data in that way. But I think there's kind of good standards in life sciences, earth science, those sorts of things, that a lot of data are now being shared with these open licenses, and people don't need to be worried about, well, that there's more of a trend towards allowing data to be shared under these open licenses.
Great, thank you so much. We have got a few more questions. So Elisa has asked, what merits a separate data publication versus just making the data available in a repository? I'm not sure, Guy or Matt, if either of you want to take that one.
Yeah, I can take that if you want. Yeah, more papers the better. I think it's a good question actually. So it might depend on what stage you're at in terms of the analysis, interpretation and conclusions that you might draw from a particular data set. So some people have found that they're not yet at the stage to analyse a particular data set, or they don't know exactly where they're going to take it, but they understand that that data would be useful for the community. So a lot of people are interested in actually just releasing the data as early as possible by using the format of a data paper, essentially, where they don't need to then create a narrative around it, discuss particular results. They can just detail how they created the data, what it's used for, and maybe a couple of examples of use cases, and allow the community at large to then start using that data. And equally the other way around as well, where perhaps a group has made use of that data in as much as they see fit, and actually they've perhaps been requested, say, the data by lots of people. Maybe they're being asked lots of questions about how to access the data and how to use it. And if you can just publish that as a standalone piece with the description of the parameters, how you've used the data, and so on and so forth, it then becomes a living resource essentially for the community, who can then go ahead and use it for their own purposes, to reanalyze or write different papers on. So I think there's a few use cases where it's handy to have a standalone data paper, as well as just making the data available in your own research article.
And I think increasingly researchers are having very specific skills that they're having to learn to do their research effectively. And I think data management is one of those real key skills that academics might not have had to, in some subjects, worry about 5 or 10 years ago. And so I think having these data note type articles allows researchers to get more publications, get more credit, more kudos, more discoverability for the work that they've done, not only in collecting that data, but also curating it, preparing it for sharing. All the extra work that we've talked about doesn't necessarily give you much for your CV, but if you've made that data open, then writing a data note allows you to get another publication and maybe gives you as an individual a chance to highlight the skills that you've learned and show that your expertise in data management that you've learned alongside whatever research question that you're tackling. So yeah, I think there will be lots of good cases for having not just a data note and a data set, but also thinking about a triangle of data note and research article all together for the same topic.
Great, thank you so much. I think we've got time for just one more question today. So this is a good one from Julia. Can you see a tendency of the fields in which researchers are more open to sharing their data?
Maybe I'll go first, because I think me and you might have kind of different answers here, which is potentially quite interesting. So I think before I came into this open research role, I was working on the Earth and Environmental Science journals at Taylor & Francis. And we were doing a lot of work with COPDES, which is the Committee on Publishing Data in Earth and Space Science, and working with groups like the American Geophysical Union, who've been taking a really strong lead on data sharing in those areas. And I think that's taken off kind of regardless of the publisher. Lots of the journals there now have open data policies. But I think part of the reason for that is a lot of it's kind of climate data, satellite measurements. So there's no GDPR, there's no personal information, there's no consent forms. Like, it's quite easy. I'm massively generalizing here. It's more easy to share some of that data than where individuals are concerned. The other area that I've really seen a lot of interest in is in psychology, as I mentioned. People may know that about 10 years ago, what's called the crisis of psychology, where they've found that lots of the main studies weren't replicable, lots of papers were retracted, some researchers lost their positions for unethical behaviour and fabricated data. So there's been a lot of work in that subject area to increase transparency, reproducibility, and we're seeing a lot of journals taking efforts to have more open data policies in that area to really highlight the transparency and the research and the trust in the research that researchers are working on in those subject areas. So yeah, so those are the two main areas that I see, but I think it'll be different for Gui.
Yeah, I'll only add briefly to that, just that F1000 research, I suppose, from the angle of what we've seen typically in the past, it's been mainly life sciences, so biology, biomedicine, and health sciences that have typically shared a lot of data, potentially because not because of the ease of doing so, but because of the societal benefit of it and the necessary, I suppose, benefits of sharing something rapidly. That's precipitated a lot of the data sharing. And some communities have been slower to do that. They've taken up other aspects of open science, whether it's open access or open peer review or whatever, but have been a little bit slower to take up the open data side of things. And that's probably a mixture, like you say, possibly a cultural thing between different groups, but also simply because of the funder mandates that have come out from various groups, and also because of the ease of putting together a lot of this data. So some fields have been slower to do so, but we think over time that will start to change quite a lot. So you'll start seeing engineering, physical sciences, for example, and increasingly, hopefully, humanities and social sciences outside of psychology starting to share their data more freely and more openly, as it becomes obvious that that's something that academics are given time and space to do and the support to do, and ultimately it benefits themselves and everyone else.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've heard recently from colleagues is since F1000 launched the new Open Research Europe platform, which people with funding from the EU can use to publish their research, which is powered by F1000, that actually a lot of the papers that have taken advantage of that so far are from the humanities and social sciences, which is really interesting. So I think we are seeing, and I wonder if that's maybe because there's a lot of venues in life science, earth science that allow researchers to publish openly with these open data policies, but it's much less common in humanities and social sciences. So the fact that F1000 provides these policies and this support to authors is showing that there is some appetite for this kind of publishing and this level of data sharing in those areas too, which is wonderful.
Great, thank you so much, both of you. We have had a few more questions come in, so I would just advise to anyone who we've not been able to answer your question today, please feel free to email us. There's an email address on the screen, or through your GoToWebinar invitation, you have my email address, and I'll make sure that we get back to you with the information that you're looking for after today's session. So I'd just like to thank Gui and Matt for your time today. This has been really, really helpful. I hope that everyone who tuned in has found this to be really useful. And as I mentioned before, please just feel free to get in touch via email if you have any follow-up questions or you want more information about the resources that we have. I will end the webinar now. Thank you very much, everybody.